I would like to hand over at this point to Dr. Gavin Mudd, and I'm going to take a seat and enjoy this presentation myself. Welcome, Gavin. Would you kind of introduce yourself? It saves me from doing it wrong.
Yes, my name's Mudd, and I've been involved in community groups for, I believe, almost 20 years now. So I've been fighting the dirty stuff. I've been involved with Friends of the Earth and the Anti-Nuke campaign, and like Mark and a lot of us, I guess, we've been sucked into this sort of vortex of what is coal, what is CSG, and really the great moral challenge of our times, which unfortunately hasn't gone away despite September 7. So what I want to try and do in just under half an hour or so, and then we'll handball to Mark and we'll play good cop, bad cop, is paint a sense of actually what the questions are. Because I don't have good answers to them. I have some ideas and some issues and so on, but I don't really have the perfect answers, and no one really does. Right? And so I think by hopefully explaining a lot of that and getting that context out there, hopefully that helps you understand what the issues are and which way we might need to go. Let's see if we can get this up and running nice and smoothly. Alright. Mike, are we recording? Do I need to use that, or
We're not fully we're recording the video, but
okay.
That mic is not connected.
Okay, anyway, if anyone can't hear me, just put your hand up and I'll see if I can shout even louder. But in a lot of ways, I think Mark and I, this is probably about our 15th talk on coal and coal seam gas over the last year or so, just in Victoria, let alone others, and proof that I can't type quickly on misspelled seminar, but the Russians would be proud. Now, I want to start with this, because in some ways, this cartoon, I think, explains everything much better than I can. It's an old cartoon, it's a goodie, right? And in a lot of ways, when you think about the history of technology, of the energy debate, and certainly where the origins of groups like ATA came from, it was back in the oil shock, it was back in the anti-nuke movement back in the 70s. And so really, this question hasn't changed, this issue hasn't changed. In some ways, it's maybe the emphasis and the focus has shifted a bit, but certainly the basic challenge is still the same. Why are we continuing to dig more, to drill more, and why aren't we really looking at a proper sustainable system that actually is renewable? That's still the same basic premise. Now, for people like me, I've been rusted on in the sort of the movement to look at the dirty side of industry. Like try to slow down whether it's uranium mining or increasingly coal. I did my Ph.D. down in the Latrobe Valley when I was still working with inside industry before I got too involved in the community side of things. But this basic context is still the same. It's still the same fight. But the game change really is the fact that we're now talking about a global problem. It's not just a fight for energy security and cost in Australia. It's effectively the consequences are global. So in some ways, that's really what I want to try and get through, because that's the debate. On one hand, you've got groups talking about the fact we've got heaps of energy in Australia, we should be selling it to whoever, however, at whatever cost, to local communities and whatever price we can manage to get for it on the international markets, including even Victorian brown coal, which stuns me that actually we're even talking about potentially exporting it. And so for all the sorts of things about the environmental side. So hopefully out of all of that, hopefully people will be a bit more informed. Now, if we look at energy, we're not short of energy in Australia. We're short of smart politicians, perhaps, but we're not short of solar thermal, we're not short of solar PV, we're not short of wind, tidal. We actually do have heaps of coal. I wish I could say we're running out of coal. We are running out of, in some ways, even conventional gas is debatable about whether it's running out or not. Oil we're definitely running out of. Victoria's only 10% of what it used to produce in terms of oil. But in some ways, the standard political answer, the standard industry answer, is just dig more. Bigger coal mines, larger scale, export more, and drill deeper, drill harder. Go further offshore, deeper, all the hallmarks of peak oil. And so in some ways, that's the real debate. That's what's really going on behind the scenes. And at the moment, you've got this fierce fight going on between the conventional gas guys saying we can continue to supply, versus the coal seam gas guys that say, no, we're the new boys in town. Probably emphasis on boys, but we're the new boys in town, we can meet the supply. And so that way we can keep the pumps going, we can keep the cooks, the stoves cooking, and the hot water systems running. But we really know, in some ways, when we look at the energy resources that we're blessed with in Australia, and I like this map because it actually puts all of it on the one map, solar, wind, and others, like even geothermal. People are often surprised when I say geothermal is just not ready. It's great, I'm happy for taxpayers' money to fund the research and development on it, and potentially one day it may even become viable, but there's a lot of issues with it. That's a whole other talk on its own. But anyway, the problem is we're not short of energy. What we're short of is intelligent debate about the impacts from different energy systems, our consumption, and actually the global context of all of that. Right? So in that sense, when you're looking at this, the big difference, of course, is climate change. Now, when you're looking at coal, well, all the three-letter acronyms, coal seam gas is the obvious one. UCG is perhaps not quite so obvious yet, but it's coming. It's underground coal gasification. Right? Shale oil or gas, or shale oil and or gas, right? Which in some parts of Australia is the big game that's coming, in South Australia particularly, and parts of Western Australia. Right? So in that sense, when you're looking at a lot of the systems, part of the reason that shale gas is so economic in America is not just because it's gas, because the liquids, the oil that comes from that, the condensators effectively, helps offset the costs. And so that way they're not just dependent on gas prices, whereas coal seam gas is purely dependent on gas prices. And so that way the economics and so on are much more dubious in some ways. Right? But if we're looking at it, there's no shortage of the geology out there where we can find this stuff. The Arkaringa Basin in South Australia, you've got the Paducah Basin underneath the Simpson, you've got lots of basins around Australia, like that previous map showed, where this is possible. The question is, how does the relative environmental impacts and the sort of economic benefits and impacts from that compared to other systems, I guess. Now this is the graph of Victoria, and you can see the sort of the thick platform. And of course Victoria up until the 1920s were entirely dependent on importing our coal from New South Wales. In some ways it's sort of funny how these debates keep coming back around. So in the 1920s, because of all the strikes and other sort of issues and the problems in the reliability of supply with Newcastle, of course Victoria said, stop it, we'll start burning brown coal. And so we did. We set up the State Electricity Commission and off we went. Right. Now, there's no shortage of brown coal. When you've got 2 kilometres thick of brown coal down in the Latrobe Valley alone, there's no shortage of brown coal. It happens to be some of the worst quality coals we know in the world, but in that way you can track that and look at that. There's also the amount of overburden or waste rock that you've got to dig out of the way to get to that. Brown coal in Victoria is actually pretty low in that sense compared to black coal. One of its minute saving graces. But in that sense, what that means for Victoria is that on average, we're the most carbon intensive electricity in the world. That's not something I'm proud of when I go to international conferences and I have to talk about all this sort of stuff, and I just have to say, well, look, I come from Victoria. We have to be number 1 in the carbon intensity of electricity. That's not the sort of standard I want to be setting for Victoria as in the 21st century. Might have been okay a century ago, but it's certainly not now. Now, part of my PhD and I suppose a lot of the work I was doing during that time was not just, well, I wasn't focused on carbon at that time, but all the mine waste, impacts of groundwater. There's a lot of other issues when you're dealing with mines, like the scale of this sort of mining, that beyond carbon as well. We'll come back to that. And again, where's the future? It's sort of taken off a bit, and that's remarkable that it's the privatisation phase. So it hasn't expanded much, but if you look at the mines, this is a bit of an older photo of Loy Yang. For a sense of scale, that's about 1.5 kilometres across. Of course, it's now out to around 2.5 kilometres east-west, and also a lot deeper, and so on. And so these days, what you're dealing with is Hazelwood power station that was such great technology from the 1950s that just before it was privatised in the 1990s, when it was supposed to be shut down, of course it was extended and then extended again. So in that sense, when you're looking at the scale of these industries, they are big. Not only locally, but also their contribution globally, because of their high carbon intensity. So in that sense, when I look at this sort of thing, and people will say, oh, well, we can go to gas instead of just mining the coal. Well, I don't think it's, not proven to me that this sort of system could be converted to coal seam gas, for example. Right? No one's ever done coal seam gas in brown coal, to the best of my knowledge. I've never seen any example anywhere where you take a coal resource like this and convert it into coal seam gas, but we'll come back to that. Now, as I mentioned, this whole debate about peak oil. This is Queensland data. I must actually update to Victorian data as well, but in some ways it's a similar problem. But Queensland back around about here said, Houston, we have a problem. And they said, well, actually, if we don't start coal seam gas, we're going to start running out of our own gas supply. And so around about 2000 or 2001, the Queensland government set a target saying they want 50% of their domestic gas supply to come from coal seam gas. And people always say that industry can't change rapidly, or that we can't actually implement new technology rapidly. To which I say, bollocks, of course we've done it. We've done it with mobile phones, we've done it with heaps of things. Computers, banks, lots of things we've always done that with quite regularly. And so in less than a decade, Queensland's gone from a massive conventional gas supply to 70% of their domestic gas supply now coming from coal seam gas. And they've reached that already by about 2008, 2009. Right, so they far exceeded their targets. Right, and what they also realised in the process of doing that is that the resource is actually huge, and why not export it? And by connecting it to the export market, they triple the gas price, push up our gas prices, and the industry says, thanks. Meanwhile, we all say, why is our gas price going up by 3 times? And Mark will talk more about that later. So in that sense, that's part of that debate. That's part of these other layers of complexity that sit around this whole issue around coal seam gas. Because it's, in some ways, it's a recognition that peak oil is real, that's happening. The Latrobe Valley, Bass Strait offshore, sure, there's still a fair bit of gas left, enough for 30 odd years at sort of current consumption rates. But what we're not being told is that now that gas is 15% carbon dioxide that's just being vented straight out the year, 1 million tonnes a year, thank you very much. So it's getting harder. So the conventional gas is getting greater impact, it's deeper, it's further offshore, higher pressure systems, all the hallmarks of what we now come to know as deepwater horizon. But in that sense, if you look at coal seam gas, typically the canary in the coal mine, and it's amazing how some people still think that they use canaries in the coal mine, but these days we're generally more sophisticated, unless you're quite clever. Coal seam gas, and I don't really like you calling it natural gas because it's not natural once you yank it out of the ground. But anyway, it's methane. So it's either a problem or you can actually extract it. These days we can, with the technology that exists, we can even burn it down to a few % methane in the air, coming say from ventilation and so on. So these days actually the technology exists to even to burn methane at such low concentrations. Now one of the big important differences between say conventional gas on the right and coal seam gas on the left is your conventional gas is typically a sandstone. So it's a sort of a nice granular media, very porous. So I like a bag of marbles is the analogy I like to use to say whether it's gas or groundwater, things like that. But often because of the compression and the geological history, often methane, same for oil, is under pressure. And so by drilling into that formation, you're often getting that strong release initially. So you get a high amount of methane to start with, and then over time, all you're pumping is more water for a tiny bit of gas. But the infrastructure's already paid off, so then it just becomes an economic game. Then of course what you can do is hydraulic fracture, so you can actually increase that a bit more if you want. And then if you want to go even more, you then do bug stimulation, you bacteria down and help generate a bit more methane as well. Right, so there's ways from an oil industry point of view to try and extend that out even further and further and keep squeezing a bit more out every time. Or you go to the other big resource, which is coal seam gas. But the nature of gas held in coal seams is very different. Instead of actually being held in the pore space, in those gaps between the grains, it's actually held under pressure on the surface of the actual coal seams. Right, so it's that actual, what they call pleats, right, so basically fracture. And because of that pressure mechanism, you need to reduce that pore pressure initially. Once you reduce that pressure, then the gas starts to flow. Now what they also don't like to tell you with these sorts of graphs is that this scale is logarithmic. So literally when you look at it, it's like that, up and then down really quickly, and then a really long tail. And so what that means is that you have to keep drilling. You have to keep drilling heaps of bores, and then eventually, once you've got that long tail, you can either hydraulic fracture or use bug stimulation or other methods that they're currently looking at. That's why they have to have such a large number of bores over such a large area, because the volume of methane coming out is so quick that actually this sort of time frame is very condensed. And that's the problem with coal seam gas. It needs lots of bores over a large area in order to get that constant flow. Now, one of the other things that I suppose people like me come from is this background of how to think about regional groundwater systems. If you're going to build a big open cut mine in here, or you're going to start pumping groundwater, either for farming like we see there with the stock bore, or coal seam gas as well. Right? There's a large amount of water that we have to pump out to get that gas out. It does vary. Right? But again, we're looking at this is a regional geological cross-section, sort of a conceptual model. And what this is looking at, sort of in some ways like a lasagna, multiple layers. So our ground layers are our aquatards, as we call them, so our low permeability barriers like clay, mudstone, sometimes shale. Coal seams are often considered aquitars. They're considered barriers to groundwater flow. But we also see the sandstones, in this case the Hutton, the Precipice. These are the sandstone aquifers of the Great Artesian Basin. So they're quite important for water sources. Now sometimes we might be monitoring that, sometimes there may be groundwater bores there that are extracting water. But what's also obvious is right down the very back there, you've got the Condamine alluvium. It's a large paleo channel full of gravels, and over the top you've got these nice basaltic soils derived from the volcanics on the Great Dividing Range near Toowoomba, etc. So you've got the black soil plains, great for farming, and underneath is this incredibly rich alluvial aquifer, great for groundwater. Right, and so what we've got to look at, if we start pumping out water here, you've got a low point and you've got higher water pressure above and higher water pressure below. And we all know what happens when you have that sort of context. Water will start flowing. If you induce a hydraulic gradient, you will get water flowing. So if we start pumping out water here, we'll potentially induce water up, reduce water down. But not only that, we know from the Latrobe Valley, from the Bowen Basin, from mines and groundwater systems all over Australia and around the world, you pump on gigalitre scale, you get large regional drawdowns. Not just around the bore for 5 metres or 10 metres, but sometimes kilometres, sometimes 50 kilometres or more. And it all depends on the permeability of the aquifers, how thick they are, and other characteristics. But in that sense, when we're getting that sort of stretch, the drawdown impacts not only around the bore here, but they can stretch right up to the Condamine. So that's some of the debate that's going on in Queensland. I'll come back to that. Now, you always hear this argument that actually it's only a small bit, it's only a small area, it'll take up less than this room. But of course, that's not the real issue. In some ways, it's also what they're flaring, products of incomplete combustion. So you're getting lots of lovely aromatics and other things in there that could potentially explain some of the health impact people are complaining about. You've also got the water. Coal seam water is often not that good. It's salty, it's sometimes radioactive, and sometimes it generally has a number of organics in it derived from the coal. So even if you don't inject anything, you're still leaching out and pumping out poor quality water, and that's got to be managed. Right? Now, one of the other big differences between, say, a coal mine and, say, coal seam gas is a coal mine, you drill an exploration bore, work out the thickness of coal, develop your mine plan, ask for approval first before you start digging, and if that approval comes, which is a pretty good bet in Australia, then sure, then you start a commercial mine. But for coal seam gas, to work out these parameters about how much water flows, what the water quality is, how much gas flows, the quality of that gas, a whole bunch of these things, you've got to actually start producing in order to work out whether it's even economic to apply for a commercial project in the first place. So a lot of the activities that are about production now occur at the exploration stage, not at the production stage. And so this appraisal process starts to happen at the exploration stage, not just at the production stage. And of course all you do when you switch from one to the other is you change name. Nothing else changes. So all you do is you go from exploration work to commercial production is the name changes and you get a different legal license to be able to do that. Right? So when you're looking at another view, and this is the infrastructure you might see up in places like Queensland, but also other parts of New South Wales or in America, you see your water separators, you see the bore going down, and a bit of work, pipe work and so on with the gas. But really that's not the main story. The main story is what's leaking out through the valves. And there may be methane, there may be other fugitive emissions as well. And it's not a matter of may actually, it's a matter of how much. But you can also see the pipelines going off. But there's also what you can't see, what's going on underground. And that regional impact on groundwater is not just local, it is regional. And so therefore the groundwater impacts from this could stretch for kilometres. And that's part of the debate. So it's not just the nature of the area, it's the nature of the impacts. And that's one of the things that I always get so frustrated with some of the marketing and the spin and the sort of the sometimes outright lies that come from industry, is it's not just about the area. If it was just about the area, then we wouldn't even be worried about things like skin cancer, because skin cancer covers such a minuscule proportion of our body, but it can still kill us. So that's the sort of thing we've got to be really concerned about. It's not the area, it's the impact that's really important. Alright? And again, this is from when I was up in Queensland back in April. This used to be a groundwater bore. I say used to be because it took 10 minutes to stop degassing first before we could even take a groundwater sample. Now this used to be a backup bore for the farmers here. Right? And so that way, in times of drought and so on, they go to that bore as a backup bore. Of course, they can't now because it's actually a gas bore instead. And again, that comes back to this regional depressurisation. So you look at the sort of infrastructure there, you also look at the fact that along the pipelines you've got literally thousands of valves right along the pipelines. You've got these pipelines carrying the gas and then the water all over the place everywhere now. So you've not only just got one point source at the bore itself, you've got other effects that are coming out now from other bores that are impacted, but also these multiple points of potential leakage. But sometimes not leakage, it's actually direct discharge. So that's actually really important. And I think this is the sort of thing that can actually start to explain the sort of health impacts and other issues that people are complaining about. Well, let's have a look at some of the data. And again, there is some data available, not all of it, but some. The production data is generally available. So we can look at the amount of water, so megalitres, and the amount of gas, or petajoules. Right, we can look at the Bowen Basin and the Surat Basin in Queensland, which is where most of the CSG, or all of the CSG activity is at the moment. So we can see the amount of water intensity on the bottom, so how much water for every bit of gas. And then we can see how much gas comes out of each well. You can see there's a general relationship there, but also the Surat Basin, the red ones, are shifted to the right a bit. So they're more water intensive. Now the Surat Basin, of course, is the area around sort of Dalby, Chinchilla, whereas the Bowen Basin is much further north around Moranborough and so on there. So, but the other thing that's really important, and there's a lot of variability in there, is not just how much water is coming out, but everything else. And there's still, despite the thousands and thousands of pages of all the environmental impact statements on this stuff, some of this stuff is still not being documented. Still data is not available and nowhere near enough to sort of answer some of the gravity of these questions. So how much salts? Depending on which number you believe, you could be looking at millions of tonnes of salt now being brought to the surface that simply wasn't there before. How many heavy metals? The organics. We're not just talking about any old organics, we're talking about organics that we know are carcinogenic, like benzene. And others which biodegrade, so they're not necessarily a big issue, but others, organic like methane, that are actually powerful greenhouse gases or radionuclides. We know that there's an elevated radon signature inside the gas fields compared to outside. How to explain that is something that we're not sure about yet, but there's certainly something going on. So all of this means, when you're looking at this sort of stuff, these are the common issues, and this is certainly not everything, but these are the big ones. There is a big debate about whether our food sources should be industrialised for gas, whether that be through coal seam gas, underground coal gasification, or potentially shale oil and gas in the future. I want to make sure, people ask me why I'm worried about that. Well, one, I'm a gas consumer, although I'm hoping to change that in the near future. But two, I'm also a food consumer. We're all responsible, we're all part of this sort of issue. Right, so in some ways, the surface water impacts, that could be a whole talk on its own, but the groundwater impacts, my personal bias, and it's not just the quality of the water, like what's also in it, but also what's happening to the water levels and how much groundwater is available. Right? And so the pollutants and so on. Right? And one of the problems when you look at this area, and it's actually stunned me in some ways when I first started looking into it some years ago, is the number of papers that have been published that actually have good data based on operational sites is extremely minimal. Right? The number of papers, you can probably count on two hands. That's globally, not just Australia. Right? This is a photo, and it's easy to go and find this site on Google Earth if you really want. It's not far away from Chinchilla, I guess, or miles. Now, for a sense of scale, that width across is about 1.5 kilometres. That's certainly not a pinprick. That's certainly not an area just of half the size of a tennis ball, like we can see here. The infrastructure, this is just a water pond. You can also see other infrastructure. You can see roads. You can see other water ponds in the background. This infrastructure is large. It is not just the size of a, say, basketball court or whatever. So in that sense, and I think that the more industry actually starts to be honest about these things, I think we can have a better debate. Right? Have a look at groundwater. Now, one of the things that, we're from Melbourne, we turn on the tap and we get water from our dams up in the mountains. We're really lucky. And I remember when Scott Ludlam, a dear friend of mine from many years back, he was in Melbourne, actually just before he got elected actually, but and it was raining. It was 2006, and I remember this absolutely crystal clear because my friend and I were just so overjoyed at the fact that it was raining because it was 2006, and I'm sure everyone in this room can remember how goddamn dry it was that year. And so the fact that it was raining, we were like just so happy. And he's saying, but don't you have a backyard bore? Because of course he comes from Perth. And everyone in Perth has a backyard bore. You want water, you turn on the tap, and it's the backyard bore. That's how you water your garden and things like that. So other parts of Australia really understand the value of groundwater and why we need to protect it. And part of the reason why Perth has gone down the whole desal pathway is because they haven't managed their groundwater. They are taking too much. Their water levels are dropping. They've lost a lot of wetlands. And so really, it was either desal or recycling. And so politically, they chose desal. Right? But again, their rainfall's dropped quite a lot. So you can look at that issue, you can look at dry land salinity, you can look at over-allocation, you can look at a whole bunch of issues. But all of these are the common things that we're worried about. Right? And we're not just worried about dropping water levels, but we're altering the flow regime in groundwater. And often, in effectively, a permanent regime as well sometimes. Right? But the flow from deep aquifers to shallow, whether it's the balloon coal measures in Queensland that sit beneath the Condamine alluvium, and so then you're mixing poorer quality water as well. You can get potential for explosive build-up of methane. And we have to make sure when we're sampling some of those bores back in April, because we're very careful, especially around things like static electricity or things like that. So, but also, and I always feel guilty when I go to rural communities, because as a Melburnian, I've never had to worry about protecting my groundwater or my water sources because I've taken it for granted. Right? It was only in 2006 that I think a lot of us really got that shock of actually what that really means to be very dependent on water. Right? Now, one of the things that industry often think I make stuff up. That's fine. I'm happy to be accused of all sorts of stuff, but making stuff up is not one. Right? Now, if you look at Canberra, it's the only operating commercial coal seam gas field in New South Wales, and it's just on the outside of Sydney. But you could read through the text, but this is the sort of important thing. This is the standard of regulation that's sort of evolved. Is that 2006 and 7 they said, groundwater is not a problem, and yet they don't even have a single groundwater monitoring board. Now, how the hell can anyone say that there's no impacts on groundwater if you have no groundwater monitoring boards?
Sack the science minister.
Sorry?
Sack the science minister, and no problem.
Well, if it was easy as that, then we'd solve it. But so anyway, I did some work for the community in the Hunter Valley about 4 years ago now. Right, so, and I pointed this out to AGL that they're making claims that they have no impacts on groundwater when they have no data. And I kind of like how the subprime loans work. There was no data, therefore there was no problem. So I thought, okay, as part of my talks, I'd go back and actually double check. That was early 2010, so I checked the report. But the text has got a bit longer, but the same basic point. Not an issue, why are you worried about it? Now, if it isn't an issue and they can demonstrate that there actually is no impact on groundwater, that's called field work, that's called groundwater bores, it's called monitoring, it's called real science. Not hard to do. Sometimes it's hard to actually get people to realise that in order to have good science you need good data. Good data requires field work, requires real data, not made up assumptions. Alright? So in that sense, when you look at these sorts of things, that's the way the industry's often evolved. It's, but these things will never go wrong. We've got thick aquatards or other things, and don't worry, we've got no data, so you can't prove us wrong. But something's going on. Clearly something's going on in Queensland, and that's what we've got to get to the bottom of. So you can look at the Condamine alluvium, and this is from a student. This is what I always find quite remarkable. One of my fourth-year students at Monash was able to go through some of the data and at least start to answer some of these questions and open up a lot more in the process. But again, there's some data available for some of the groundwater bores. Unfortunately, the Queensland government's turned off this service, so you can't get this data as easily anymore, but a lot online anyway. But look at this bore at the top. So this is the blue diamonds there. That's a bore in the Condamine alluvium, up and down a bit. And the magnitude of that change is not much. But when you think about the area of the Condamine alluvium in this area, it's very tens of kilometres wide. These sort of small changes in groundwater level are huge changes in the total water supply or total water volumes available. Right, it goes up and down a bit, of course, drought, floods, goes down again, and then miraculously coal seam gas starts up, and we've got the biggest drop in history. Now, I argue that's due to coal seam gas, or most likely due to coal seam gas, because if you think about that earlier cross-section, normally, pre-CSG, the water pressures in the balloon coal measures were higher than the pressures in the Condamine. And that's now reversed. So instead of having a pressure gradient that actually took the deeper water at a very slow rate up into the Condamine, that's dropped. And so now you're getting that reversal of that gradient, and so now that's starting to drain the Condamine. And so I think you can use this sort of data to help explain what's really going on. But if you go to a different area, about another 20 kilometres away, all the bores are going down. And miraculously, when coal seam gas starts up here, you see sort of the purple diamonds, most of the bores are still going down at the same rate, one's even gone up. And that's the variability of the system. Now, it doesn't mean that we'll never see coal seam gas impacts on that, and it probably means that farmers are pumping far too much groundwater as well, which a lot of those farmers have already gone through a lot of pain over the last 25 years to reduce their allocations in places like the Namoi and the Liverpool Plains and the Condamine and elsewhere, precisely to address this very problem, only to have the CSG companies turn up, take over some of those licenses and be exempt from the same process that they went through. And then the gas companies are wondering why the farmers are angry. If you look at some of the stuff that's coming internationally, and this is a bit of a glimpse. How many people have actually seen Gaslands, the movie, or the documentary? For those who haven't seen it, also see the industry response called Crack Nation, and then Josh Fox's response to that, Gaslands 2. But this famous scenario that Gaslands made famous of taking water or beer and being able to set it alight. Now normally you wouldn't think you'd be able to do that, but industry said you can't explain that. And so what some people did in Pennsylvania, some researchers then actually said, well, can we explain really what's going on? Can we prove where that gas is coming from? Right? Now, in the shale gas areas, and generally what the shale gas areas in America are quite deep, they're 2 kilometres, and so they're going down a fair way. Now, what they show, you can use isotopes from the carbon and hydrogen and so on to be able to show whether the gas is coming from shale or whether it's coming from sort of shallow, sort of natural groundwater processes. And what they showed is that clearly the gas in these shallow groundwater bores is clearly coming from shale, which is 2 kilometres down. Right, now you look at the cross-section, this is a nice geological cross-section, so the Marcellus shale, it's quite famous now, always impressed when Americans use metric units like metres, but somehow the gas from here, at 2.5 kilometres down, is getting up into here, into the shallow areas. Now, I don't think it's hydraulic fracturing, and what's really remarkable when you look at the, when this paper was published a couple of years ago now, is that all the letters to the editor that came in. And some said, oh, you didn't find any hydraulic fracturing chemicals, therefore you can't prove it's shale gas. Sure, I think that's true. But clearly the gas is shale gas in origin, and I don't think that other professors that of petroleum geology wrote in and said, yes, clearly it's shale gas, so it must be leaking bores. And I think to me that's probably the most plausible explanation. So in that way, that's how you could potentially explain gas getting up that way. But again, where's the data that shows all of this? The monitoring data and other things is just not there. Now, part of the other evidence for this, right, if you're looking at the data part of this paper, so that how far away you are from a gas well, and certainly there's some bores that are the same as natural background. Most of the time methane's quite a reactive sort of molecule. It tends not to hang around too much in groundwater. It's a good energy source, so it tends to get consumed by bugs or things. Right, so most of the time you shouldn't normally find it, but sometimes you can. But certainly when you look at really close to a gas bore, there's some that are really, really high. Now, where was the data prior to these facilities being put in? And again, there wasn't data done because they just assumed there wouldn't be any leaks, assumed there wouldn't be any problems, so why would you waste money on monitoring? That's the problem. Right? Now, I remember just over a year ago, it would have been about May, June 2012, I actually had 5 minutes in front of my computer, quite a rare event at Monash, but anyway, it happened. I just happened to see one of the little posts that posted this video of the Condamine River bubbling, and the good old methane detector going absolutely through the roof. Oh, that's the exact area where my student did his study. Now, what I found really funny in some ways, because you've got to have a twisted sense of humour when dealing with this stuff, is that rather than actually say, well, let's have an investigation and work out what's really going on, the Queensland Government and industry said, no, can't be CSG, and then they announced their inquiry. Now, for those of us who, like Yes Minister, would call that the Humphrey Appleby approach, where you already know what the answer is and you just announce an inquiry that's really going to justify exactly what you already thought. So in some ways, I think that's a real problem. But again, coming back to that conceptual model, that way we think about groundwater, this is how you can look at it. This is a sort of an adaptation of what was the Queensland Water Commission report, which looked at the cumulative impacts on the Surat Basin. Ironically, it came out a month before this video went out. And we can see that now that we've dropped the pressure down into balloons, and again, it's our basic mechanism of how CSG works, drop the groundwater pressure, or pore pressure to be specific, that allows gas to flow. Not all of our gas is going to go sideways straight into the bore, some of it will go elsewhere. And so by doing that, you're now allowing gas to start flowing in places where it didn't before. Now, I take very seriously the fact that local states never happened before. They've never noticed that. And I think that's something that you just cannot ignore. Now, I work with communities all around Australia and elsewhere. I've learned to take strong heed of that sort of local knowledge. I can't walk into a community and pretend I know more about their groundwater system than they do. They're the ones who've been using it, sometimes for 4 generations. So in that sense, when you're looking at this sort of scenario, where's the data? And you look at the QWC report, of course, there's no monitoring pools in this area. So no one can prove what it is, no one can disprove what it is. Right? Now, one of the other things, I thought I'd keep this graph in here, I was going to delete it out, but that's great. When I was working down the Latrobe Valley, I've almost finished the handball to Mark, but when I was working down the Latrobe Valley, the theory was that the groundwater drawdown from all the coal mines and power stations would only affect the Latrobe Valley, and that it would never overlap with the drawdown in the declining groundwater pressure that's coming from Bass Strait. And the other sort of common myth, which we now know is a myth, is that Bass Strait is offshore, the groundwater impacts from that will never reach onshore. Now, if you look at the Gippsland Groundwater Atlas, which Southern water released late last year, and the green line and the red line are two bores in the deeper aquifers that show you, basically, you've got almost 30 years now of a long-term decline in groundwater levels in these deeper aquifers, thanks to Bass Strait. So it is reaching onshore. Those farmers know about it because they're actually having to lower their pumps quite regularly now. And then the community, the Victorian government and industry is wondering why those same farmers are now saying no to even more. Because you've got potentially tight gas in this area at sea spray, and then you've got this potential for coal seam gas and the potential for underground coal gasification. And so when you actually listen to farmers and actually hear what they're saying, they're saying, well, we're having to deal with this. We're already lowering our pumps regularly because of this. So these impacts are there, and that's, in a lot of ways, that's why I often argue that by looking at what's the impacts of coal mining or other things like that, or uranium, I'd much rather deal with stuff above ground, like solar thermal or solar panels. Right? So in that sense, I used to think when I first started down this path several years ago, looking at this stuff, it was all about better monitoring, it was all about better science and actually having groundwater data that we could all hang our hat on. But in some ways, that's really not the main game. There's a higher level debate about what our energy future should be. And I think that's the point I always start with, and I always finish with that point. But in some ways, these 2 points. I think there's been a real problem in the way that we've dealt with the monitoring and other impacts. So what you get down to is, yes, there's real risks, and as I keep trying to say to a lot of folks in the industry or government, you cannot generate the kind of community movement that not only in Australia, because I've heard from farmers when I was in America back about 4 years ago about what their experience was. You cannot get the sort of community movement that's now global without something being there, without something being able to sort of light the fire, so to speak, pardon the pun. Right? So on one hand, you've still got governments and industries saying, look, trust us, there's no impacts, you can't prove anything, there's nothing wrong, this is great, it's better than coal, and yet it's still 10 times too high from a climate change point of view. And yet on the other hand, when you listen to farmers and you go and visit these places and see for yourself, the impacts are real. The conduit line's bubbling, the bores are no longer groundwater bores, they're gas bores, and so on. And I think to me, this is the final point that we always keep coming back to. I mean, why are we continuing to drill deeper and go harder for more fossil fuels in a climate change context, when really what we should be debating is actually how do we transition, reasonably to 100% renewable energy and a much more sustainable infrastructure in that way. And I think that to me is one of the big debates that's going on. And it's not only just a debate or a fight between the conventional gas guys and the coal seam gas guys, it's a fight between the fossil fuels and renewables. Right, so hopefully that's helped people. A few different acknowledgements, but I'll just leave those up for cartoons and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
This really is about our energy future, and essentially there's a big fight going on between a massive expansion of coal seam gas and other fossil fuels and renewable energy. And what happens now, we're locking into the structure for decades. So we're at the point now where we're either going to be locked into a future with coal seam gas wells right across Australia, or we're going to have, we'll have the opportunity for renewable energy to stop being alternative energy and start being mainstream energy. So it's really crucial at the moment in history. The Australian Institute, I'll just briefly introduce the Australian Institute. We're a not-for-profit research organisation based in Canberra. We do research over a whole range of issues that we think are important for the political and economic and social debate in Australia. And one of the areas that we research is the impact of mining and resource industries on other industries in Australia. Because the resource boom in Australia is, as I'm sure everybody is aware, is a massive phenomenon, and it has huge impacts on a whole lot of things. And one of the things it impacts is other industries, other Australian industries like tourism and manufacturing and agriculture. So we do a lot of work looking at that. Over the last, these are some of the papers we've published on that over the last 18 months. They're all available for free download on the internet. So if people would want more information about all of this stuff, including the presentation that I'm giving tonight, I'll have a sheet out front. You can put your email addresses download, and I can send you all of that. There's a little bit of overlap with Gavin here, but I want to do a few things tonight. The first thing is to actually just talk a little bit about the infrastructure of the gas industry, to sort of make it concrete and talk a bit about some of the statistics. And the second thing is really to talk about the impact, the actual economic impacts of the mining boom generally, of which the gas boom is a big part. And the third thing is to talk a little bit about the impact of gas exports on gas prices and the domestic gas market. So the first thing I'll just point out is that, as Gavin was saying, we've got coal and gas under, in underground layers, and they cover huge areas of Australia. So, these grey areas are areas with gas underground, and a lot of these areas, they actually go right down into New South Wales and up through Queensland, and a lot of them coincide with huge areas of pretty fertile farmland and forest. So a lot of those areas that coal seams are underneath look a bit like this. And obviously there's a couple of ways to, and all of the coal seams basically contain three things, as Gavin was saying. They contain coal, water and methane. And to get an economic value out of that, to use it for energy, there's a couple of ways that you can exploit it. And the first one obviously is to just dig it up, dig the coal out and burn it. And the second one is, coal seam gas. And again, this is overlapping a little bit with Gavin, but I just want to sort of make a point with it. Essentially, what they're doing is they're drilling down, they're pulling out all the water from the coal seam, and that's taking away the pressure that's been keeping the methane down there for geological ages, and that allows and it's vast amounts of water, of course, and that allows the gas to migrate up the wells. But as Gavin was saying, it also allows the gas to come up through a whole lot of other pathways, potentially through existing geological cracks or cracks induced by fracking, for instance, or old boreholes and that kind of thing. So I guess the point I want to make is that we're talking about tens of thousands of square kilometres at least of these areas where all the water's going to be taken out of these coal seams. And so that's a vast area to de-water, and it's a vast amount of methane coming up all over the place. This is all driven by, this expansion isn't driven by the need for gas in Australia. It's driven by export, and liquefied natural gas is just the methane that's taken from either conventional gas or unconventional gas. And because you can't actually export gas in its gas form, because it would just take up too much room, what they do is they pipe all the gas to export facilities. In Australia, they're building a bunch of them in Gladstone, but there's also one in the Northern Territory and a few in Western Australia at the moment. And they run that gas through big things called trains, which are basically big refrigerators, and they freeze the gas. They freeze the gas to about minus 160 degrees Celsius, and that allows them to turns it into a liquid basically, and then they can put it on a ship and send it overseas. So that's liquefied natural gas. It's just methane that's been frozen in liquid form and put onto a ship so it can be exported. And the reason that they're doing that, particularly at the moment, is that there's a lot of energy demand in Asia. Australian gas prices have been for a fair while around $3 to $4 a gigajoule. So kind of around this level. But in Asia over recent years, the gas price has gone up to about $16 a gigajoule or $17 a gigajoule. So if you can export it, you can make a lot more money than selling it in Australia. And so that's what's actually driving this whole thing. I want to just kind of describe the overall, where the infrastructure is and where the gas fields are and who's running them essentially. So in Queensland, all of those big rectangles are where the gas fields are in Queensland, in what's called the Surrounding Basin. And so those gas fields are, as Gavin was describing, all of that infrastructure, and all the pipelines converge on Gladstone. And in Gladstone, they're building the three big gas export terminals where they process it and send it overseas. That's the overwhelming majority of coal seam gas in Australia at the moment. But there's also a bit in New South Wales, and the main areas in New South Wales are around the Gunnedah region, which is around here, and that's particularly centred on the Pilliga State Forest, which a company called Santos is exploiting. There's also a field in Gloucester, which is farmland, kind of between Newcastle and Coffs Harbour. That's a much smaller field. The Gunnedah Basin one is the Pilliga gas field's a lot bigger. There's some around Sydney, and there's some up in the kind of northern rivers area that a company called Metgasco was kind of the main company. And there's also a few smaller ones. For instance, there's one there, Wollongong, which is actually the Sydney's water catchment area, is called Dart Energy. That project looks like it's actually been stopped. If we look at Australia, all the gas reserves like conventional and unconventional gas, these graphs just break down what kind of gas it is, where it is, and what companies control and what projects it's related to. So you can see in the top chart, 85% of gas in Eastern Australia is coal seam gas, of the 2P gas reserves. So the more accessible gas, there's a whole lot of levels of gas reserves, but 85% of what they call the 2P gas reserves is unconventional gas, and the blue section, 15%, is conventional offshore gas, mostly in Victoria, but some in the Cooper Basin in South Australia. You can see on the next graph over that the overwhelming majority of that coal seam gas is from Queensland. So that's the Surrounding Basin, those gas fields are in Queensland. So the other areas, for instance, the Gunnedah Basin is the yellow bit there, so it's much, much smaller. And this breaks it down by state. So you can see Queensland's massive compared to other states. And there's a bit of a breakdown on the different projects there, but I'll just skip to the next one. This actually shows the companies that own the reserves around Australia. And this is really interesting because the only two Australian-owned companies are Origin Energy and Santos, and together they own about 19% of the gas reserves. So the other 81% is foreign-owned companies. A lot of them are actually big state-owned companies, mostly from Asia. So I'm saying this because it's not really about Australian companies exporting Australian gas overseas. It's about overseas companies exporting Australian gas overseas for the most part. Just to give an idea of some of the scale of the infrastructure, there's 4 big projects in Queensland, and they're big export projects. They're all kind of in the same order of magnitude in terms of size. The smallest one is the Santos Gladstone LNG project. These are the gas fields, and that's Brisbane is about here, and Gladstone's up the top there. So it's about 350 kilometres going north-south and about 200 kilometres going east-west. So you can see the kind of scale, what a massive area this is. And there's four of these big projects. 3 of them are under construction, one of them's just been approved at a state level. Now, for this one project, the smaller one, as you can see, it's mostly a foreign-owned venture. It's going to have 3 of these. They're planning 3 of these trains, if you like, at Gladstone. They'll ultimately be up to about 10,000 wells. The first stage is about 2,500. It'll cover about 18,000 square kilometres. Compressor stations, huge water treatment facilities, about 20,000 kilometres of roads, 6,000 kilometres of just gathering, water and gas gathering pipelines, and a huge pipeline to Gladstone. So that's the this is a massive amount of infrastructure. And that's what it looks like from a distance. So essentially it's an industrial gas grid that's covering tens of thousands of square kilometres, possibly up to 100,000 square kilometres in Queensland. As Gavin mentioned, a lot of this infrastructure, the water treatment stuff is absolutely huge. It can get pretty messy. This is the Pilliga State Forest in Queensland, where an unlined pit, they put the production water from the coal seam into an unlined pit so it can sink back down into more superficial aquifers. Just putting all those pipelines through is really invasive. Like they have to go 100 metres wide and they just go through farmland and forest. And these are big export terminals they're building on Curtis Island near Gladstone, and this, believe it or not, is in the Great Barrier Reef Marine World Heritage Area. There's 3 of these, with possibly a 4th one under construction as well. So at the moment, Australia is the 5th largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, so we're a big player. A lot of gas export is actually by pipeline, but the stuff that you ship overseas, we're number 5, and we export from a couple of places a couple of terminals in Western Australia and one in the Northern Territory. So it's about 20 million tonnes a year at the moment. By 2020, that's going to be ramped up to, it probably won't go quite as high as this, but at least sort of somewhere up around 100 million tonnes a year. And that'll mean Australia will probably overtake Qatar as the largest LNG exporter in the world. And I'm putting that there because it gives you a size of the scale of it, but also how many projects they're building at once. And that's really important from an economic perspective. If you do something really massive in an economy, then it has huge economic impacts. And it's not just the gas industry that's building all of these massive projects at once. It's also the coal industry, which has plans to basically we're already the 2nd largest coal exporter in the world, and there's plans for Australia to actually double that over the next 10 years. So there's huge amount. There's about 60 huge coal mine expansions going on in Eastern Australia at the moment. So you're building all of these massive projects at once. And when you do something that big, it has huge impacts, on climate, for instance, but also obviously farmland, water, and all those kinds of things. And one of the impacts that it has is on the economy. And I'm going to focus on the economic impacts of that tonight, not because it's the most important necessarily. I think the other impacts are really the most vital things. The climate and water and food is really important. But I think it's important to look at the economic impacts because all of these projects are justified on the basis of their economic benefits. When you think about it, there's no upside to building a massive industrial gas grid over 100,000 square kilometres of Australia. The benefits that they're being sold on are the economic benefits, and a lot of those are really questionable. And essentially, industry has made the case pretty successfully to Australia that they're the golden goose of the Australian economy, that our prosperity rides on the continued expansion, particularly of the coal and gas industry in Australia. Now, the thing about such a massive expansion with mining is that the more mining you have in the economy, the less you have of everything else. And that's because mining crowds out other parts of the Australian economy. It particularly crowds out export industries, manufacturing, tourism, agriculture, and overseas education. And it does that for a couple of reasons. The first is that it drives up the Australian dollar. When the Australian dollar goes up, if you're exporting commodities, whatever you're exporting from Australia, you'll receive proportionate, because Australian companies are mostly price takers in the international market, you'll receive that proportion by and large. There's complexities about it, but you'll by and large receive that proportion less in export income. So if you're exporting exporting manufactured goods from Australia and you're selling them in the US for $100 when the Australian dollar is 70 cents US, you're receiving a lot less for it when the Australian dollar goes up to $1.05 or about 95 cents US as it is now. And that is largely, or the dominant driver of that increase in the currency is the mining boom. There's three main reasons that the mining boom drives up the Australian dollar. The first one is that because of the huge spike in commodity prices, people overseas were buying Australian, were having to pay several times as much for the same product, for the same amount of coal and gas, coal in this case, coal and other commodities that they were a few years ago. So in Australia, the coal price was, the coal price stayed around $30 to $40 a tonne for years and years and years. Then it went up to $180 a tonne, and now it's down to about $90 a tonne. So for every tonne of coal, people had to pay 2 or 3 times as much. And that meant that increased the demand for the Australian dollar. The second thing that happened was because it became so much more profitable, mining companies invested a huge amount in expanding existing mines and building gas fields, and that brought in a massive influx of capital into Australia. So the investment pipeline, as they call it, is about last year was about up to about $268 billion, which is really unprecedented. It's dropped a little bit just recently, but it's still a huge amount of money coming into the economy. And the third thing is that because the economy overheated a bit, the Reserve Bank has kept interest rates high relative to other countries. So we've got historically low interest rates, but it's high relative to other countries. And when the economy overheated, they said, well, we need to keep up interest rates so that it becomes more expensive for companies in other sectors of the economy to borrow money and expand. It still pretty much didn't really impact the mining industry because they borrow most of their money overseas, but capital became more expensive in Australia, so it was a deliberate attempt to cool down the non-mining sectors of the economy to free up labour and capital for the mining sector. Overall, this is against a whole bunch of different commodities. Overall, the Australian dollar has been high relative to all of our major trading partners. Now, there's complexities in this because the Australian dollar goes up and down for a whole lot of reasons, so it will always be fluctuating. But I guess the way to think of it, and the American economy will have an effect on those fluctuations. But the way to think about it is that the mining boom has added a whole, I don't know, it could be 15 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents to the Australian dollar over a fairly long period of time. And that's a whole world of pain for our major export industries. The second way that the mining industry crowds out, the mining boom or the mining expansion has crowded out other parts of the Australian economy is by creating a skills shortage. So although the mining industry doesn't employ a lot of people overall, it does create a big demand for particularly for a fairly narrow range of skilled workers. And when you're building all of those projects at once, there's a really big squeeze on those workers. Now, all of those skilled people were trained up in basically agriculture and manufacturing over years and years and years. So when the mining industry suddenly started paying them twice as much as what they were earning anyway, it drew people away from those other industries, particularly manufacturing and agriculture, and it made it much more difficult for them to get labour and retain labour to operate, and also increase their costs across the board. So that's had a bit of a crowding out effect on those industries as well. So agriculture's been really hard hit because they're price takers in the global market. And what we did was we said, well, if the dollar had remained at its pre-boom average of 70 cents that it was from the 80s when it was floated through to the start of the mining boom, the average was a 70 cent US dollar. We looked at how much less farm export income the agricultural industry has made using that 70 cents as a baseline over the last, over the period of the boom, And companies like, for instance, industries like the beef industry lost about $3 million last year alone on that measure. So a huge loss of export income for farmers, and they're also competing against much cheaper food imports because imports become a lot cheaper with a high dollar. Tourism's a really interesting one. We're not exporting goods per se, but holidays. But Australia becomes a much more expensive holiday destination for overseas tourists, and overseas becomes cheap for Australians. So over the period of the rising exchange rate, we've dropped by about 250,000 net arrivals to Australia a year. And really interestingly, in Queensland, in far north Queensland, they've had a drop in international arrivals of about 20% over the period of the boom. And at the same time, there's been a global boom in tourism because you've got greater affluence in developing countries and cheaper air flights. So you've had a massive increase in tourism globally and a drop in far north Queensland. So that gap is kind of the effect of the exchange rate. So a really serious long-term impact on other industries caused by a massive increase in mining, and of course the manufacturing jobs that we've heard about, manufacturing jobs being lost, particularly New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria over many years, and that's all part of that as well. Now, there is a kind of a sense that people say, well, it's kind of see it as a bit of an inevitability, but it's a real choice that Australia's making to allow so many of those projects to go ahead at once, and the macroeconomic impacts of that need to be taken into account. It's not just the Australia Institute saying that that this is happening. You actually just have to look at the economic impact statements of the proponents of these massive projects. So the Arrow LNG project in Queensland, as part of their approval process, they have to say what the economic impact's going to be. They acknowledge that single project will cost about 1,600 jobs, including about 1,000 manufacturing jobs across Australia, and crowd out about close to $500 million to manufacturing activity. And Clive Palmer's China First Mine, their environmental impact statement acknowledged that it would cost about 3,000 jobs across Australia as well. So this is something that everybody accepts is happening. If you take a big step back and look at the macro, Australian economy, this shows our mineral exports as a percentage of GDP back to 1969, and this is all of our other exports. So the red line is our diversified economy, if you like, so manufacturing, tourism, agriculture, and education for the most part. So from the late 80s right up to the start of the boom, our diversified economy was going really well. We're exporting a lot more diverse goods to the world. Then with the start of the boom, everything else headed south. So if you like, that's kind of taking a big step back and seeing the decline of our diversified economy as mining crowds out all of those other sectors. Now, that would be fine, some people say, if everyone could just go and get a job in mining. So there's a theory, the Reserve Bank, for instance, have the view that if Australia's got a high dollar and commodity prices are high, well, we've got a competitive advantage in just ramping up our coal and gas exports. People can go and mine in those businesses or make more money. Now, there's a few really big problems with that. The first is that mining, and including the oil and gas industry, is a very low employer. Mining, this represents the entire Australian workforce. Mining employs about 2% of the Australian workforce. The oil and gas industry employs less than a third of 1% of the Australian workforce, and the coal industry less than half of 1%. So it's very, very capital intensive. They don't employ many people, so what you're doing is you're displacing jobs in in labour intensive industries like manufacturing and tourism, and it's very difficult to provide that amount of jobs in mining because it's so capital intensive. The mining industry often talks about their, they say, well, okay, we don't employ very many people, but we create all of these indirect jobs. So they use things called jobs multipliers. And they'll say, they often use 3 times jobs multiplier, for instance, and they just multiply the direct jobs they create by 3. And it's true, the mining industry does create indirect jobs because mining workers go and have coffee and, mines buy materials in Australia and all those kinds of things. But every industry creates indirect jobs. So if we accounted for the jobs the way the mining industry does, we'd have about 30 million jobs in Australia. Because, if every company used those jobs multipliers. So the only way to really compare the relevant jobs is to look at the direct jobs. The gas industry recently have been having a big PR campaign, and the industry representative body claims that they created 100,000 jobs last year. We actually just went to the ABS and looked at how many jobs had been added to the oil and gas industry in the last 12 months, and it was actually 9,372. So they've been using a 10 times jobs multiplier, if you like. And remember, a lot of these jobs they're not new jobs in the economy, they're not jobs soaking up unemployed people, they're jobs where skilled people have been poached from the manufacturing and agricultural sectors. Another really important thing is that the mining industry is overwhelmingly foreign owned, and that's important to remember because overall they're about 83% foreign owned, and that means that 83% of the after-tax profits go offshore to overseas shareholders. So that benefit's not being captured in Australia. The mining industry is very poor. They pay a significant amount of tax, but they pay a low rate of tax compared to other industries. The corporate tax rate, theoretical tax rate, is about 30% in Australia. The effective tax rate across all industries is a bit over 20%. Last year, the coal industry paid 8% and the gas industry paid 6%. And one of the reasons for that is that they get a lot of subsidies and tax deductions. So there was about $4.5 billion worth of deductions to the mining industry last year. It's true that on top of that they pay royalties. Royalties are a payment for raw materials, and they're actually tax deductible as resource rent taxes and the corporate tax. So other businesses, like if you're a baker, you buy wheat to make your bread. If you're a builder, you buy bricks. We normally don't consider that as a tax, but we consider royalties as a tax where the companies are buying raw materials from the Australian people because the Australian people own it and they buy those royalties from state governments and pay royalties to state governments. So they're really a business expense, not a tax, but technically they're counted as a tax. But we should also see that, and often what the mining industry does is it says, well, we don't pay that much in corporate tax, but add royalties, and that becomes a significant amount. It is true that royalties are significant sources of income to state governments, but I think we should see it in perspective. For instance, when all of those massive projects in Queensland are going at full bore in 2016, 2017, they're estimated to pull in about $450 million a year in royalties. That'll be equivalent to about 1% additional income revenue to the Queensland government. So, 1%, $450 million is significant, but we should see it in context. The other thing I just want to briefly touch on is this idea that's very prevalent in Australia that mining saved Australia from the global financial crisis. The Treasury Secretary, Ken Henry, for the last over a 10-year period, pointed out that if the mining industry dropped 15.2% of its employees within 6 months of the GFC, and if every industry in Australia had done that, we would have had 19% unemployment. So a lot of. How am I going for time? How long have I been going for?
You're okay.
Okay. So I guess the point I want to make is that jobs in mining are important, jobs in the oil and gas industry, etc., are important. but we need to balance them against the jobs in other sectors are important as well. And we need to balance the interests of that sector against the interests of the rest of the economy, a diversified economy. What I want to touch on now is what I kind of call the great gas crisis swindle. So it's just about to come to Victoria, but it's been happening in New South Wales. The gas industry the coal seam gas industry has been basically held up in New South Wales for 2 years by community opposition. And the gas industry and the government have come out very strongly and said, if you don't allow these projects to go ahead, if these projects don't go ahead, New South Wales will run out of gas and gas prices will go up. Now, the gas, essentially what the gas industry is doing here is it's created a problem in the first place because the massive gas exports have created, driving up the gas price. It's beating that up into a full-blown crisis, saying everybody's going to run out of gas and we won't have any energy left. And then it's blaming community opposition for the rising gas price, and then it's creating another. And then it's saying the solution is to drill for more gas, which is a solution that isn't actually going to bring prices down or secure energy for New South Wales. So if you like, they've created a huge problem. They're blaming community opposition, and they're proposing something that won't actually solve the problem. But they're making a lot of money out of every step of the process. So just a few kind of reality checks here. So this is actually the wrong graph. This is actually electricity demand in New South Wales, but basically it's been projected to go up for years and years. Electricity demand's going down, but gas demand is going down as well in New South Wales and right across Eastern Australia. So gas demand is going for a whole lot of reasons, but gas demand is going down rather than up. Gas companies, the reason prices are going up is that if you're a gas company, you have the option to sell as much gas as you want overseas. You'll be selling it into the Asian market ahead of. You won't want to be selling it for $4 a gigajoule when you can get $16 a gigajoule in the Asian market. So the price will equalise at basically the Asian market price minus the cost of liquefying and transporting it, which is called the net back price, and it will be probably they're estimating between $9 and $12 a gigajoule. All of Eastern Australia is connected by a pipeline, so we're all part of one big gas market. And this just puts it into a bit of perspective. This is all the gas that we use in Australia at the moment, our domestic demand. This is the amount of export capacity, if you like, that we're building at the moment. So it's about twice Australia's demand we'll be able to export when those big export plants have been built. These are the proposed LNG plants that they can build if they have more gas. So the only way drilling more gas brings the gas price down is if you have a surplus above what you can export. But the point is they can just keep expanding their export facilities to export as much gas as they find. So there's not going to be a surplus that's going to bring prices down in Australia. So the thing to remember really is that it's all about exports. The last point I'd like to make is about energy security. So the idea's put out there that we need gas for our energy security. Well, there's been two big energy security issues in Australia over the last couple of decades. In 1998, the Longford gas explosion tragically killed 2 workers and wiped out our gas supplies in the middle of winter in Australia for several weeks, causing about $1.5 billion damage to the Victorian economy. And in France, in 2009, a gas pipeline exploded and wiped out 30% of Western Australia's gas supply for 3 months and caused, there's estimates, between $3 and $6 billion of damage to the economy. Solar panels, wind turbines don't do that kind of thing. Gas is a highly volatile substance, and there's a huge energy risk, and it's as not that frequent, but these plants do blow up, and that is an energy security risk. As I was saying, I think we're at a fork in the road in terms of what our energy future is going to be in Australia and around the world, and whether if these gas export facilities go ahead as they're planned, it's not just locking us into gas for decades, it's locking the rest of, huge amounts of the rest of the world into gas for decades. All of the things that we use gas for, there are alternatives to. It's already cheaper to heat our hot water in our houses with efficient electrical systems than it is with gas. Renewable energy is coming down, in terms of gas-fired power generation. Renewable energy is coming down in cost while the gas price is going up. So there's going to be a crossover point with PV. That's arguably already happened in different parts of Australia, and there's alternatives in industrial use as well. So we have a really clear choice, and this is really the moment that Australia has to choose. And I think the ATA is actually a really important player in that, because you guys actually have, as an organisation, captured popular support for renewable energy, and you represent a lot of people who are really keen on renewable energy, and so I think you can potentially, and probably will play a really important part in what path Australia goes down in the future. Thanks very much.
Oh boy. I don't have to answer the question. Okay.
Is there any chance for those presentations to be available for community presentations? I'm from South Gippsland, and sometimes I'm asked to do some community presentations, and there's so many useful data, and there's,
If you want mine, just fill this will be out in the foyer, just put your name and email out there, and I'll see anyone who feels that I'll send you that presentation. Probably not all of it, but some of them I just haven't.
all in France, that I would never.
Yeah, and they'll have all the references and all those kinds of things too.
Yeah, happy to share. That's fine. Just email me or something like that. But or grab it off here if you can grab that off. That's fine.
While we're on the topic of the presentation, we do have the option of putting the sanitised, edited, whatever version you like to call it, on the ATA website.
Yeah.
We do get requests from members who are unable to attend the meeting to be able to do that. If you're prepared to do that, we would be most happy to.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. Look, I guess actually I'll do that, and in fact, put your name down if you just actually want to be kept in touch, because we constantly release research on this. So put your name down if you want to be kept in touch on that. There'll be one out. There's one out.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to ask, one thing that's become evident here is that it's the energy demand that's driving gas to a degree. However, I got the impression in the past that gas was considered largely a waste product, and when the energy needs changed, it went up in price, and they actually started to capture it when they, in some cases, weren't beforehand. One of the arguments I got at the time was that gas was the interim solution as we move to renewables. In other words, we've got energy problems in fossil fuels, gas is an interim, but my understanding is that a lot of that was based on the actual emissions profile of the gas. So if you're a big country that wants to reduce your emissions, if you move to gas instead of coal or diesel or whatever, you actually reduce your emissions. However, I would feel that you two may have insight to it, but it suggests to me at the moment that the profile of gas, with the amount of potential fugitive emissions there, and I've heard someone say it, that it's approaching that of at least black coal. So in other words, its whole economic justification as a low to interim fuel seems to have evaporated. Is that true?
There's heaps in that. I'll try and deal with it quickly, and Mark will go as well. We're not shutting down coal. In America, they're not shutting down coal. it's plateaued a bit and come down a tiny bit, but that's also because America is going through a major recession. There are some coal plants in America that have been shut down and converted to gas, like coming from shale. Now, if you go through the numbers, let's play hard and fast. Coal, black coal, is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide for every megawatt hour of electricity. That's a good global average wherever you are, except if you're Victoria or Germany. Now, natural gas in Australia is around about 0.6, 0.7, depending which number you use or things like that. And that's full life cycle from the facility, or from the ground to the gas plant and so on. Now, magically, groups like Appia argue that coal seam gas has a life cycle cost of 0.3. Right? Now, if you're looking at gas as a transition fuel by 2050, and you're looking at the sort of the 80% reductions by that stage on a global basis, allowing for an increase in economy and so on, greater population, greater affluence around the world, all of these sorts of factors that we don't necessarily want to stop, but we want to make sure we make intelligent choices about this that the plant can cope with. Right? Even at 0.3 is still 10 times too high, because the only way to meet an 80% reduction by 2050 globally is to hit renewables, 0.05 or less. Right? Now, that's the sort of the basis of it. So even if you assume that Appia is correct, technology beeps at you, it's still 10 times too high. Now, if you assume that what we're seeing in Queensland, what we're seeing in the US, and what's coming out elsewhere, that it's 0.6 or 0.7 or even up to 1 or more, it doesn't take much methane, being about 20 to 25 times more powerful in terms of its global warming potential than, say, the carbon dioxide. That only takes an extra tiny bit of methane in fugitive emissions to push that life cycle cost up to 1 or more. But it depends on how much of those emissions you get. But we don't have the data. It's just not out there. Industry's often made these assumptions that things don't leak, things never go wrong, the geology is perfect, there's aquitard's always right. All of these assumptions that, even if only some of those are wrong part of the time, that means the emissions are a lot more. And so, in reality, it's clearly not 0.3, it's probably close to somewhere 0.6, 0.7, but even if it's coal, but we're not shutting down coal. In Australia, we're not, even in America, they're still mining 1.1 billion tonnes a year. This is being added on top, right? And it's not actually replacing, it's actually being added on top. Right? So in reality, it's not the game changer, it's not anything else, it's a bunch of companies out to make a ton of cash. Simple as that.
Please, did you have a comment? Just very quickly, just remember also that when you export gas, and this gas is going for export, a quarter of the gas is used to refrigerate it and export it. Right, so that adds 25% to life cycle emissions. Now, all of those big projects in Queensland were approved on the basis of 0.1% fugitive emissions, and when they've actually measured, they've taken atmospheric measurements in the US, because we basically measure our, a step back. Methane is incredibly powerful greenhouse warming potential. The recent IPCC reports increased its greenhouse warming number from 21 to 34 times CO2. So a small amount of leakage makes a big difference. When they've actually, the NOAA, the US National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, actually did atmospheric measuring in Denver around shale gas fields, and they found that they were finding around 4% leakage. So, so the leakage could be way higher, and that makes a really huge difference. The other thing to remember is it's not actually just about replacing coal, because gas is displacing renewable energy. So, the whole coal comparisons are kind of, pretty limited anyway.
Right, I don't care how many hands go up, I'm a sucker for a blonde, and there's a blonde who's had a hand in the air for about 5 minutes, so your question.
I have a question for Gavin Mudd. What I find really hard to understand is this no data thing. I know personally someone living in Darwin whose well has gone down 30 metres. They've measured it. It's only gone down since the CSD companies have moved in. Then there's the NPI reports of the tonnages, and tonnages like 680,000 tonnes of nitrous oxide from, gas compressors and formaldehyde and stuff like that, and people are sick right? But there's no data, apparently. I'm just wondering why, you know, there's gas bubbling in the Condamine River, and yet there is no, you know, what do you call it? People have said, well, that hasn't happened in the last 150 years. Why? But it's only happened since the gas companies moved in. Like, those very strong, how do you put it? You know, when this happened. Why is that no data? I just...
how strong is your faith in democracy in the government? You know, I'm not trying to be coy, but this is what's driving a lot of the farmers to actually ally themselves with greenie sort of thing. Is they thought that government was supposed to be there for the public interest and manage, you know, competing interests sometimes, whether it is say gas and farmers, and they're just not.
Does it have
They're just not. They're
written
not
by
resourcing
somebody with
their
a
own
doctorate to say that it's data?
But the problem is that government's supposed to be the ones who do monitor, check the data that's coming in from companies. And when you go through things, when I was absolutely stunned, and I was sitting at one of the community meetings in Broke in the Hunter Valley, and one of the coal companies, one of the guys from the coal companies there, almost accosted me and said, how can you say they've got no groundwater monitoring data? That's outrageous. I said, well, it's all right for you. You've got 50 groundwater monitoring boards that you send people out to monitor all the time. You've got the data. They don't. Right? And he found it really hard to understand. Now, I don't understand why that's either.
All the time. You monitor it all the time because when
That's
you
what I
put a bore,
say. It's a government
it
problem.
doesn't stay at the same level.
Yep.
You know what I mean? It might drop a bit during the dry season. I mean, you're always monitoring your bore.
But that's what government is supposed to be doing, and they're just not. And that's the problem.
So
And that's why you've got communities allying
government's
themselves.
not doing it, what the farmer says, oh, well, my bore has dropped.
Yep, but that's anecdotal.
Too bad.
That's the problem. And so industry says you can't prove it, and it's actually really hard to go through and get the level of data you need to be able to prove conclusively that yes, it is coal seam gas. Right? And so it's actually, there's a lot of work involved in that. And so, it's, as I say, it really comes down to the fact that government is so allied with the gas companies, and that's what it comes down to. It's hardcore politics at the end of the day. And the science has been stripped under the carpet.
So there is data, it's just being refused to be acknowledged by the government, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I can't find a lot more data in Queensland. Like, there's supposed to be monitoring bores for some of the projects in Queensland, and it's just not public.
Every
So,
farm.
anyway, there are other questions, so I want to get
Can I suggest that when we get to a long back and to and fro like this, we will have time after the meeting to break up and have chats in groups. Question from
I
the back.
actually don't have a question, but I do have a petition within the Environment Victoria. People would like to sell that can't stop the massive coal mining that they've got planned in the 4 kilometre field down the 90-mile beach. If people would like to sign that, that'd be great. Yeah.
Can I suggest that we put on the table outside so that it can be with the other forms that we can fill in? Thank you.
Is there any comparative production costs between natural gas from the Northwest Shelf and from coal seam? Is there any advantage, either of those?
Yeah, it's beyond my area of expertise. Coal seam gas is more expensive to, generally has higher costs to extract than conventional gas, and also conventional gas also has often has oil with it, so that's added value for the company extracting it. But the kind of complexities of the comparative costs is something I couldn't really speak to in detail.
It's actually a really complex question, actually. I wouldn't have a clue on it.
Looking at that map there, one can see many waste dumps, water waste dumps. What's the long-term environmental impact of those? What happens if we get tremendous rainstorms or floods? Are we going to have this polluted water running down rivers and creeks and damaging farm areas and bush and...
It's already happened in some places. I remember a story about 3 years ago, I mean 2 years ago actually, but anyway, one of the farmers had, was talking to a CSU company that had the legal right, they went and drilled, and the farmer said, don't go in the floodplain because it'll flood. And the CSU company said, wasn't doing that. In 3 months, it never floods. It hasn't flooded for 10 years. We're in drought. And of course, that was early 2010. What happened? Floods came straight through, and that feeling we got completely flooded in. Right, now there's debate about whether the photo, because the photos that you see on Facebook, if it's on Facebook, it's generally true, literally centimetres away from the top. Now there's debate. The locals say yes, it did overtop. The water went over the top and then flooded into the pond, and then that went out. Unfortunately, when they got the photo, there's that small difference where the walls are outside. So there's debate about whether it actually did overtop or not. But you only have to go to America and other places. So it's not hard. When you've got facilities like this, it's an engineering risk. Pretty simple. If the bathtub fills up, it can overflow. And if you get a big storm coming through, we know that. One of the things that was quite bizarre back about 4 years ago, there was an accident at Lady Annie. Anyone ever heard about the Lady Annie wine accident? Kind of proves my point. At the same time, you had a big spill of oil, or water spill actually, in Moreton Bay in Brisbane, that had local impacts. You had 50 kilometres of a river being acidified to pH 3 in Western Queensland. And not just that mine, you had every other mine had their, sometimes their tailings dams overtopped, their water ponds filled up and overflowed. During the early floods in Western Queensland of 2009, every single mine in Western Queensland breached their environmental conditions, some seriously. And at Lady Annie, you not just had 6 foot star pickets, you had 6 foot star pickets that no longer became star pickets, they were completely dissolved. Right, so you had one of Australia's worst 21st century mining accidents on a project that was built in 2007 under modern environmental regulation. And that happened. The company actually got fined at $500,000. It's basic risk management. It shouldn't be that hard from an engineering point of view. These are obvious risks that we need to manage for. And yet you get the assumption that, oh, we can drill in floodplains and do all this stuff, and it's never going to happen. And that's the culture of the industry. When you hear what locals have said and the stories that are going on, to me, I find that anecdotal information very, very important. You know, I don't ignore that. So I think it's unfortunately, a lot of my other colleagues in the profession say if it's not published, it's not real. You know, if it's not in some report, it's not real. Now, I think community movements are very good at oral history. They are very good at the sort of teaching the next generation or things like that from our collective memory. But governments and companies tend to work on the fact that if it's not in some report, it's not real. And that's a real problem because that's how mistakes keep getting made. So anyway, I think that's probably a lot more than you're asking about. But,
Yeah,
Is there a typical sort of life expectancy that these fields are projected to yield for? And then what are the obligations after the field is no longer commercially viable in terms of maintaining the infrastructure and the bore heads to stop leaks?
Typically they say they are required to put up a bond up front to supposedly account for that. It's really hard to get good information on that. What we know of, there's sort of some of the stuff that's coming out in different parts of Australia. There was next week, sorry, the week after, I'll be going to southeastern South Australia around Kingston and Canberra and so on. Now, companies went along in there and drilled for coal back in the 70s and 80s. And actually did what was considered good practice back then. They actually cement plugged the borehole, so that way it supposedly seals it. Now, you come back 30 years later and you can actually play it like a joystick because the ground's moved and the concrete's cracked and everything's opened up, and you actually look 40 metres down to the aquifer and actually see the hole opened up. So what was standards 30 years ago is simply not good enough. Now, what was government's response? The landlord's got to pay $30,000 to fix it. They didn't cause the problem, and government's supposed to be looking after it, and that company's long gone. Well, actually, that company still exists. It was called Western Mining Corporation, which of course is now part of BHP. But in some ways, they were allowed to walk away from their lease. They thought they'd done what was a good thing, and come back 30 years later, and it clearly hasn't been good enough. Right? And so now you've got farmers down there that are saying, hang on, if that's happening with those, and we know this even just in general groundwater, the bores don't last forever. We know that from the Great Arctic Basin, anywhere. Steel corrodes, plastic, what degrades. All of these things are quite real risks. They're not hard to sort of get your head around. But government doesn't want to deal with good mechanisms to deal with that. One of the things, Mark will probably add to this as well, but one of the great reasons why we should be taxing mining a hell of a lot more is so we can put a sovereign wealth fund aside, so when the resources are finished or there's really not much left or whatever, we can actually live off the money from that, which Papua New Guinea didn't have to go into debt during the GFC, neither did Chile, neither did Norway. So why didn't Australia? Because we refused to put the money aside, we spend it, like spendthrift, and then we wonder why we're still in debt, and then when we get hit the GFC, we've got no money to go to. So there's that argument, but then there's also the argument that actually, when we look at the scale of modern mining, we look at the Hunter Valley, the Bowen Basin, even the Latrobe Valley, and you come back 10, 20, 40 years after mining's finished, and that's the stuff I've been doing for years. It's actually going to old mine sites. You can come back to sites like Mount Morgan, which closed 30 years ago, go downstream in the Dee River, and it's pH 3, 30 kilometres downstream, and completely green and blue from all the copper and stuff that's in the river. It's biologically dead, it's gone. So that's the legacy that's left, and so we should be putting money aside to make sure that just in case we get some of these things wrong, there is money aside that continues to maintain and fix these things in the future. And it's just not done. And the industry says they do it, things like that, but it's just not done anywhere near the scale of what these risks really represent. And I could talk ad infinitum about other mines around Australia and that sort of problem, but it's just not being done, and that's a real problem. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. So not sure if it does, but I hope it does.
You're next, but may I just quickly follow on from that? There's a point that came up there, but I'd like to re-emphasise that. You said that there was a plugged hole in the ground made by a mining company, went bad in the long term, and the farmer had to pay, the landowner had to pay. Is that common knowledge, that the ultimate...
Starting to become more common knowledge. It's only really come out over the last couple of months.
But that must be a bit scary for the farmers who are being approached by the gas companies to say, well, we'll give you $500 a year or whatever it is to have a well on your land.
Yep. But not only if they're getting $500 per well, let's say they've got 10 wells, that's $5 grand a year. Now, if your labour costs and other input costs go up by 30 grand a year, where's the benefit? You know, as Mark would say. So, in some ways, it's that's the sort of total equation we really should be looking at, and it's just, it's not done very well. Thank you.
One of the things I was understanding about was fracking was a big thing. It's read in the papers all the time. And that concerns me with, well, what are we going to do with the layers of ground above where they're fracking? And are we going to lose our artesian water, etc.? It's an area I know little about, and it frightens the hell out of me.
Fracking is a sexy issue, you know, in some ways. I actually don't think it is. You know, and people are really shocked when I say that, but ignoring fracking, 80% of the coal seam gas bores in Australia are not planned to be fracked. So 80% of coal seam gas is going to happen without hydraulic fracturing. Right? Now, a lot of the impacts I'm talking about are that 80%, not the 20%. Now, add hydraulic fracturing in, and sure, some of these risks multiply, and sure, some of the chemicals they use are stuff you might find at home, like baking soda or acetic acid, other things. But sure, you don't start pouring it into your coffee every morning. So a lot of these things, the risks around a lot of the chemicals are about context, but there's some other stuff that's horrendously toxic. Biocides they put in there deliberately to shut down a lot of the bugs so that they can't cause gases that impede flow. Right? And we know that because that's what used to happen in the conventional oil industry when they started putting in seawater in order to pressurise the system to drive more oil and gas out. And they realised that by adding in lots of sulphate, that created food for bugs and it created all sorts of other problems. Which is why they started realising that things like bugs are important. You know, so you put some biocide down there to stop that, then you put other chemicals down to stop the clay swelling out and then shutting the system down. So all of the chemicals they use have a specific geochemical or biological purpose, which is why every field's different, every mix they use is different because it's all very specific to that particular bore, which is why it's a secret concoction in a lot of ways. But sure, a lot of the chemicals they use are not necessarily toxic, but it's also about context. Now, if those aquifers, if we're pulling the water out of the coal seam, and some of the chemicals from the coal itself, like benzene, toluene, or the BTEX chemicals, they can leach out of the coal seam even if you don't inject them during the hydraulic fracturing process. Right? So there's risks there as well. But if you start pulling the water out of the coal seam, you get water flowing in. Right? And of course, when you turn that off, you get sort of rebound in the groundwater, and you're getting sort of migration as well. So they don't capture all of the chemicals. You know, and there's debate about whether it's 80% they capture, 50 or 10%. And it's going to vary depending on how much you trust the operator, how much things are over. Seeing you've got good managers on site that are making sure everything's done properly, which of course doesn't always happen. So in that sense, there's always going to be some left back down there. And some of those chemicals are worth worrying about, but in the vast majority of cases, like 80% of coal seam gas is not going to have hydraulic fracturing. Shale gas has to, and that's so there it is a big issue. But certainly for coal seam gas, and people are always a bit shocked when I say that, but that's certainly my view.
We've got a question from this gentleman on the side, then one in the middle, and then on the front here.
Have you been watching the energy producers from the hot rocks department? There seems to be two companies in Australia who are trying to produce energy from hot rocks, both of them in central Australia, sort of.
Yep.
And is it going to be a significant producer for you? What do you think?
It's like a lot of things. It's in principle a good idea. Right? In reality, it's technically very complex, and it's actually technically more complex and challenging than coal seam gas. You're going down 4 kilometres. How to actually assess the heat values down there and how much of a heat reservoir it is to get the potential energy that's extractable, that's a very technically challenging thing. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty with it, and I haven't checked in on this recently, so I'm going from stuff I looked at a few years ago. They have to hydraulically fracture, because you're dealing with hot granite and it's under pressure, so generally there's no cracks or fractures that actually allow steam flow or water flow. So they have to do that. Now, when they did that, and I used to sit on the Great Artesian Basin Committee for some years, they actually used C4 explosives to do that. Now, when they did that, of course, it caused a Richter scale earthquake of about 3.3, which, you know, is not huge in the grand scheme of things, but it was only supposed to be 2. So they're about 10 times out there. Right? Now, in the same sense that people talk about earthquake risks around shale gas or coal seam gas and other things, it's certainly a risk, but it's often with the re-injection of the water or the wastewater that's where all the earthquakes have been shown to be caused so far, not the actual extraction process, but the injection process. Right, so there's that issue. We don't know when you start putting water down in these systems, you're under high temperature, high pressure, the geochemistry, we don't know how much, and you keep recycling the water like that, and of course you're losing some, so you're concentrating salts. As you concentrate salt, some will precipitate out, that will seal up the cracks, some may dissolve the cracks. You've got radionuclides to deal with. If you're going down that deep as well, you've got the sort of the combined heat flow from things like potassium-40, low levels of uranium and so on as well. So there's issues around that have to be assessed. I'm not saying it can't be done, it can't be assessed, and you know, it may work and it may actually work quite well. It may be a lower overall risk, but there's so much technical uncertainty in all of that that at the moment that it's just not ready yet. Now, with a bit of R&D, and I'm happy for taxpayers' money to go into that rather than clean cigarettes like carbon capture and storage, because at the end of the day, there is a potential public good there if it does come off. But at the moment, it's just not ready yet, from my understanding. Now, it took 10 years to even connect the first pilot plant in South Australia. And it was, according to the original plan, when I first joined the GAV committee back in about 2003 or before, they were supposed to have 1 gigawatt of power plants actually operating now.
It is.
And they've got 1 megawatt.
Oh, megawatt, yeah.
Right. It's technically very, very challenging. They didn't get their material selection right, and a whole bunch of other things. Now, some of that's solvable, and they have solved it. But it's a hot concept. You know, it's good, but it's got a long way to go. A long way to go.
I'll just add one very quick thing to that. Just that, you know, you've already got things like solar thermal power that you can, you know, how much they cost to build, how much electricity they're going to produce. You know, the commercial off-the-shelf technology is ready to go. So it kind of seems crazy to focus too much on that when we've got stuff that's just ready to go now and does the same thing.
There we go.
Yes, when you're talking about dewatering your ground to facilitate coal seam gas to flow, what's happening with that water? Is it simply just being put into large ponds and allowed to filter back down, or what are we doing with it?
Historically, in Queensland, they were allowed to build evaporation ponds, but farmers didn't quite like the fact that you're getting salt storms coming off them and so on. But also, they realised that the sheer volumes they were dealing with, when you start multiplying, when you look at that expansion that Mark showed, you start multiplying that volume of gas by the amount of water that's going to be produced, the amount of land area you need to evaporate is just never going to work. Right? So about several years ago, or maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Queensland government said, right, you're only allowed to build storage ponds, although nothing changed, they just actually had the same facilities, but now they're having to build reverse osmosis treatment plants. Now, one of the problems is they say, oh yeah, but we've got all this water, we can actually save agriculture and give them all this great water. Now, I'm not a farmer, I'm an engineer, but I understand enough about the chemistry to say that if you're looking at very sodium-rich waters, that's the last thing you want to be using in agriculture, what we call the sodium absorption ratio. How much sodium divided by how much calcium and magnesium. Now, if that ratio is too high, generally I think it's a value of 15 or more, that starts to disperse the soil and destroy the soil structure. We know that very well, that's well documented in agriculture. Now, if you look at the chemistry of coal seams, what they do is strip out the calcium and magnesium, and all you're left with is sodium. So you get these waters that have incredible star values. So hardly ideal. So what they have to do in terms of treating that water is actually start adding the calcium and magnesium back in, actually even make it possibly suitable for agriculture. Right. Now, when I was up there back in April, we were sitting down and talking to some of the farmers. They won't guarantee the water quality, but also the water quality in the gas fields are highly variable between coal seams as well as within a coal seam. So now, if you're looking at the Wonthaggi D-cell plant or the Perth one or the Gold Coast one, whatever city you want to look at, they work well. We can engineer them because they've got a fairly constant input. Things work well when you've got a good constant input, very predictable, and you can make sure you tune your system so it works well to get a guaranteed output. When you've got such an incredibly variable input for the water quality and the chemistry of that, you've got to constantly change the way you reverse osmosis plants, you've got to change the filters. If you change the chemistry, you can precipitate some things out which clog the filters. There's a whole bunch of stuff that means that the complexity of managing that is a lot more involved. Right? And so therefore, it ups the cost as well. But and so what we've said to the farmers when we're up there is, right, get them to guarantee the sort of quality that you can meet, and incorporating things like SAR values, the heavy metals, and radionuclides and organics. And if you can demonstrate all of these sorts of factors, then sure, the water might be usable for agriculture. I've never heard of a company that's yet to sort of meet that sort of standard. They're doing it, and they're providing some water at the moment, and other parts of the water being discharged into the chinchilla weir. And the concentrations they're allowed to discharge out are extraordinary. I couldn't believe it when some of the community members actually found out what the numbers were. Way higher than what we normally allow for freshwater ecosystems or for drinking water. And the argument is that it's a smaller volume than the total volume of the weir, therefore to be diluted. And we all know that dilution is the solution to pollution in the 19th century. We're not in the 19th century, I thought we were in the 20th century myself. But
tough. I know we're eating into drinking time. No offence will be taken if anybody stands up and goes to the bar. But there was a question coming from the front here, and then there's another one at the back. After those questions, does anybody else have questions that are... Okay, so we got, and one at the back, so we've got 4 more, then we'll have a bonfire. Your question.
Yeah, I'm interested in the climate impacts on methane, and Mark, you mentioned IPCC about their estimates of global warming potential from 21 to 34. I'm interested in both your comments on whether you think we should be using the 20-year, not the 100-year global warming impacts, because all the assumptions about the sustainability of gas based around this idea that its impact over 100 years is how we should be reckoning it. When we don't have 100 years, we probably don't even have 20 years to turn the ship around. So we need to be using, in my opinion, the 20-year global warming potential, which the new one from the IPCC was 84.
Oh, I just completely agree with you. I think, it's such an urgent, the climate situation is just so unbelievably urgent and scary. What we do over the next few years is going to have implications for, the geological age, and we should be using the 20-year time frame, and methane is much more powerful over a 20-year period. So, yeah, just completely agree.
in some ways, my simple answer to that, and someone actually did ask me that 6 months ago, and I said, well, it doesn't really matter. Either way, when you look at gas, as I mentioned before, you're going from 1 to 0.6 or 7, and ACNEA argues at 0.3, renewables at 0.05. So we know that really the only way to meet some of the climate change trajectories that we need to meet to address the climate change problem is 0.05 or less. So in some ways, which number you use is not really that important, but I think with the new stuff that's now coming out from IPCC, and the fact that really we should be dealing with this much more urgently. So I think in some ways, yeah, I partly agree. I think in some ways we really should be starting to argue now for the fact that it's got to be over 20 years anyway. Right? But in some ways, it still doesn't matter. Right? Because at the end of the day, it's still not good enough to deal with the nature of the problem. Even if you use 100 years or 20 years, it's still, the whole gas argument as a transition fuel is just a concoction as a diversion. It's not really the main game. The main game is still climate change and energy security, which we do otherwise. So I think hopefully that helps, but I think, yeah, these days I agree. I think we do need to be starting to say that a lot more loudly, despite our current problems.
I think the gentleman at the back was next.
I did have a question actually. Slightly going back to Mark, you mentioned the idea of solid concentration. I should probably know this one. Why was the Port Augusta solid concentrator rejected by the government?
Sorry.
There was a solar
So
concentrator
there's a-
saved for Port Augusta.
Yeah, so-
Project.
Yeah, it was a solar thermal power plant, and those, just for people who don't know, so they're solar power plants, but they use mirrors to create heat, and the heat can, rather than producing electricity directly like solar panels, and the heat's dispatchable, so you can produce electricity around the clock. And yeah, there was a proposal for Port Augusta. So what happened was Alinta, the company that owns the coal plants, made a proposal to ARENA, which is the renewable energy funding body, and ARENA rejected the proposal. And that proposal was for a feasibility study into a pilot plant, basically. So the word I hear is that the proposal that the proponents put out wasn't very good. I've always had serious doubts about whether Alinta really wanted to build a solar thermal power plant there, because they're actually a gas company. They build gas plants. We know they want to build a gas plant somewhere else in South Australia. It's hard to know what their agenda really is, how serious they were about it. And so at the moment we're trying to convince the government to make, to open it up to all proponents. So put in a policy that anyone can apply for funding, and not to go for feasibility study, just actually get on and build a big solar plant. So yeah, so there's some promising things happening there.
Yes, it was. One of the things seems clear from what both of you are talking about is that the gas extraction is new business, and it's new business by foreign companies largely. So when you talk about new business, you're actually talking about a financial growth component that isn't there supporting current industry or something. It's increasing the profits to some party. Has anyone done an analysis to say, if you invested the same funds and the same subsidies in new business, such as in renewables, what the outcome for the country would be? Because it seems to me that's what we're allowing. We're saying, yeah, go ahead, do new business.
I don't think anyone's done that. But there is also an argument as to what's driving it, is that because these are oil and gas companies. Like, there's a huge multinational oil and gas companies, right? Every year they have to put out an annual report, and in that annual report they've got to say two things. One, they're increasing their reserves. Two, they're putting more of their reserves into production. Now, if they don't do that every year, then the business will be in trouble, because shareholders will flee, because if those things are going down. Now, they were oil companies, and they found it harder and harder and harder to find new oil reserves, but they had gas as a byproduct of their oil reserves. So they started counting the gas as barrels of oil equivalent, the energy equivalent of the oil in gas, so they could book those gas reserves as reserves, so their reserves kept going up. And if you increase your reserves, then you've got to put the reserves into production. So there's an argument that no matter how, even if it's unprofitable, they're kind of driven to just kind of keep going, like, zombies, because if they stop, they're in such serious trouble. So this thing's kind of a self-perpetuating.
And they can't diversify out of it?
Well, I think the other thing you've got to remember is, so what does an oil and gas company do? It's not that they're just trying to sell oil because it's actually that I want oil. I actually want the energy service that's being provided in some way, whether it's a car, whether it's something else, whatever. Now, in that sense, it's not impossible. Now, I'm sure someone here remembers what BP actually stands for these days. When they changed their name 16 years ago, it was the first oil company to supposedly recognise peak oil and change their name to Beyond Petroleum. All right, so in that sense, you've got at least a cynical sort of response to say that, look, we're energy and we know the oil's going to run out one day, so we're going to go beyond that. So in that sense, if you're an energy company, right, if you get the energy from solar thermal, fine, great, from wind, whatever. But you ask a mining company, like same old thing, if you ask a lawyer a question, they'll give you a legal answer. Ask an engineer a question, I'll give you an engineering answer. So if you ask an oil company how to provide energy, they'll, here's more oil, or maybe gas, And so I think that's the problem we're stuck in. So rather than saying, and I think this is sort of where groups like Beyond Zero Emissions have been one of the great contributors to helping reframe this debate, is that, well, we can provide a different answer to that energy security. So I think to me that's been really important. It's not just people fighting the negative stuff, but people providing a positive side. But that specific analysis, yeah, I haven't seen anyone do that. But, yeah.
Solar is a real problem for the gas industry in Australia and the fossil fuel energy, right? Because it's stopping them making where they make most of their money out of, you know, peak prices. So, and it's a real threat. And the gas industry really fought back and got all the feed-in tariffs removed, right? Yeah. So, and that's actually set solar panels back a lot. You guys are, you know, a major, like you represent so many people who are really keen on solar. So, you know, you've got to get out there. Maybe you're doing it already, but you've got to get out there and be really vocal. You know, been putting out media releases, harassing members of Parliament, and letting people know that people love solar power. I just think that's hugely important. And the other thing I would say is, because, you know, there's no point in us all just knowing more and more about energy. Like, we know what we're into, and we need to be really vocal about it. The other thing I'd say about the ATA, which is just such a fantastic organisation, but I reckon there's got to come a point where you stop calling yourself the Alternative Energy Association.
The door prize for whoever comes up with a new name. There was a lady at the back who was next, I think, and then we'll just make it one more. Is that all right?
But small community groups like this, or small interested groups, and people like Environment Victoria are constantly, there's a lot of people interested in all these, the in-depth sort of scientific research that you have and that you disseminate to us. But I'm wondering when people like Tony Abbott and someone like Tony Abbott comes out with this carbon tax to get rid of that, do you have or whatever the industry was saying about 100,000 jobs created, when there are only, 9,000? Was that the whole industry? If you have some way of facilitating to immediately, publicly counter that statement, people who have a high profile like Gavin here or Mark has had to immediately publicly come out and counter these statements which people every day, every Joe in the street comes out and says, oh yes, 100,000 jobs, that's great, and it's gone. But, and you know, I suppose it does take time for you to gather sort of information that shows that it's seeds that's being protected.
So the question is responding to this information.
Yeah,
so the Australian Institute,
high profile,
people are doing something.
A documentary, annual documentary or something, just all the time. And someone can get out there and speak out in the paper, wherever it is, on the radio, have contacts to disseminate this information.
You're hired.
So I'll just explain how it works for us, right? We're one of the few organisations who has the kind of research expertise to respond to these things, the Australia Institute. So every time that happens, we have that infographic on the jobs that debunked it. So we'll release that, or we'll release a report or a media release, and we'll send that around all the press and try and get press attention. So, and usually we will, to some extent, we'll get picked up by, the ABC, newspapers, and so we'll get a bit of a response. But it's hard for us because the industry gets more airtime than us. So we generally get a response, but they have more volume.
We get friends in the media, don't you?
So we do that. Like we have a media, we have like one media person, and we constantly try to, we build relationships in the media. We do as much work as we can to build our media profile. So we're actually doing that work. But what limits us is that we have 4 researchers, right? The industry's got heaps of them. And so and all of those researchers are on different projects because they only get funded for projects. So the only way for us to be able to be more responsive is if we have funding to have the research capacity to turn stuff around really quickly and respond. Because every time this information comes out, you then have to get one of your researchers who's on other projects that are getting funded for. You've got to get them to do the research, to do the numbers, turn around, have a media person and respond. And often we can't do that because we just don't have the capacity. The Australia Institute relies entirely on the generosity of people who donate, small to large amounts. And so, if you find organisations, I guess what I'm saying is if you want organisations like the Australia Institute to be able to do that, then people have to kick in with a bit of donation, because that's the only thing that gives us the capacity to do that. Not just the Australia Institute, but other organisations as well.
But the other thing too, I think it's really important to remember, why has the New South Wales government actually effectively halted CSG? Why is the Victorian government, a Liberal government, put in place a hydraulic fracturing moratorium? It's not because I asked nicely, it's because farmers and others out there were fighting damn hard. Now, one of the things I take a lot of inspiration from is the fact that when you look at Lock the Gate, there's a bunch of climate change deniers and property rights and greenies and a whole bunch of other farmers who really love the land, but all working together because and they've got the capacity to do that, so they are. The media's not always a fair fight, it's and especially when you look at newspapers or other sort of things in Australia, but despite all of that, the industry is being held back because the community is responding and they are winning. Right now in Queensland, and some of the farmers up there finding, oh, you're winning in New South Wales, that means we get sacrificed. Yeah, that doesn't make me feel happy at all. But if you look at it, take a step back and actually look at it nationally, and then also how this stuff is linked internationally, people are responding, people are doing stuff, and it is driving. The media is getting somewhere, and it is actually forcing either the Victorian government, New South Wales government, or all sorts of responses out of the Queensland government industry where they have to try and address some of these things, even though they're not doing it very well. But there is a lot of that happening, and to me that's what I take inspiration from, is that community action is creating, it is kicking goals, so to speak. There's, groups like the Australia Institute, Beyond Zero Emissions, ATA, Lock the Gate, and the enormous number of different local groups that are out there protecting their passion.
Now, what about independent people like yourself or like scientists who can just encourage somehow through the network to write paper immediately and counter this?
I can talk about how much I do media, and it drives me absolutely nuts. But it's a lot. I speak to 2 or 3 journos a week. It is happening, right? And unfortunately, people like me are rare, but that's the job description. Someone's got to do it. So, so many people at Mark. Like there's only a few of us that are out there. They're out there doing either these forums or other stuff, but it's all happening. And then there's others we work with in Gippsland. There's others we work with in other states. There's a lot happening. Often it's behind the scenes and not very public, but there's certainly a lot happening in public as well. But anyway,
would it be fair to say that the deepest pockets are the loudest voices?
But it's cheaper to tell the truth. Like it's more expensive for them. Like we do have the advantage that we can actually tell the truth, and whereas it's more expensive. Like clean coal and gas as clean energy are the most audacious PR campaigns ever. Like take something really polluting and sell it as clean, right? That actually takes a lot of money to do, whereas it doesn't take so much money to say, actually it's fossil fuel and it's destroying the planet, because you've got reality on the side. So we do have some advantages. And I'd like to back up what Gavin's saying, to Lock the Gate, and including in Victoria, do a thing called coal seam gas-free communities, which has been incredibly successful. They've got whole regions of people to sign up that they won't let gas companies in. So there's a huge effort is going into opposing a lot of this stuff. So I'm just happy to share information about groups who are doing really great work and could be assisted.
And the last question is.
I'll be quick because it's more of a statement than a question. But you mentioned the moratorium the Victorian government has on the fracking.
Yep.
They're reviewing that. They may lift it. There was an article in the Age on Sunday you might have seen which discusses this. And they might come up with a logic which says we need more gas for industry. One thing I want to point out is that gas in Victoria, 58% of it is used in buildings. And of course this is something right down the ATA's alley with draft-proofing insulation, all that good stuff. The gas used in buildings could be significantly reduced. Mark showed the chart which shows the electricity demand is falling, pretty like similar to a free fall. That's not really happening in gas yet, but we could make that happen in Victoria with greater attention to how we use gas in buildings.
Yeah. Well, I think you as an audience need around is going to be quite a long meeting, and I think this is probably our record. But I hope you found it useful. I'd particularly like to thank Gavin and Mark for their presentation. So can we please